This day in sports history.
Hey, I'm golf broadcaster Matt Adams. The updated and expanded second edition of my book, The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments, is now available. Readers can expect to march with Arnie's Army at the 1960 U.S. Open, relive Jack Nicklaus's remarkable 1986 Masters win, and be amazed by the Tiger Slam. The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments. Pick it up where fine books are sold, including BarnesandNoble.com and Amazon.com.
It's This Day in Sports History, a member of the Sports History Network. It's September 17th, and on this day in 2004, a disastrous start by the Americans in the Ryder Cup doomed the weekend and led to their most lopsided loss a few days later. Hal Sutton takes a lot of heat for his decision as captain to pair up Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson for the first time ever in a Ryder Cup. On paper, putting the world's number 2 and number 4 golfer together seems like a powerhouse pairing. But as any good football or basketball coach might tell you, it's more about the chemistry on your team rather than the overall talent. And in 2004, these two did not like each other. Respect, sure. Like, not so much. They didn't talk to each other. Instead, they talked about each other to other people. Tiger called Mickelson Phony Phil due to how he pandered to galleries. Now, whether bad chemistry was the reason that they got smoked on day one, well, who's to say? But they got off to a rough start in the morning's 4-ball match against Scotland's Colin Montgomery and Ireland's Padraig Harrington. And it didn't get any better in the afternoon. Montgomery was a Ryder Cup veteran at this point, and he always seemed to rise to the moment. He had not missed a single session of a Ryder Cup since 1991. His shot out of the fairway bunker to about 10 feet on the first hole set up his birdie putt that he drained, and the Euros took a 1-up lead. In fact, they birdied the first 4 holes and were 2 up by that point. They went on to win the morning match 2-1. Now, to be honest, it had more to do with how Monty and Patty played than how Phil and Tiger played, though. The match was close throughout. In the afternoon alternate shot format, Mickelson and Woods squared off against Darren Clarke and Lee Westwood. The American duo had an early lead, but they lost it, and when they came to the 18th, the match was all square. Mickelson's drive wound up next to a fence post, and it forced Tiger to take a penalty drop. That led to a double bogey. The Euro duo rolled in a bogey putt to win the match 1-up. Tiger and Phil had been shut out. Of course, the other American teams on this day did not fare much better. They only managed a half in one of the morning matches and only 1 in the afternoon matches. The score at the end of the day was a lopsided 6.5 to 1.5 in favor of the Europeans. So how much can you draw from the data that when Tiger and Phil were split up Saturday, they each won a point of the team's 3 that day? When the dust settled on Sunday, the Europeans romped to their biggest ever margin of victory in a Ryder Cup, winning 18.5 to 9.5. Seems like even if Sutton had not put the 2 biggest egos in golf together on day 1, that it may not have had much difference in the outcome. But that, of course, is still cause for speculation. On this day in 1933, a convoluted rule in pro football got a lot less confusing and easier to call. Prior to 33, a quarterback attempting a forward pass had to be at least 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. There were also less referees on the field at this point, so that was a tough one to watch. But like a lot of rules changes, the updated version introduced and put into effect on this day came from controversy the year before. In the 1932 championship game between the Chicago Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans, Bronco Nagurski led his team down the field. They were knocking on the door of the end zone, but his first power run up the middle was stopped. On the next down, his run attempt was also stifled. On 3rd down, he ran up to the line and then he backpedaled and threw a touchdown strike to Red Grange, the galloping ghost, for the score. But the rule in those days was that a forward pass again had to be attempted 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. Now, the Spartans were vehement in their complaints that Nagurski had been within that 5-yard zone. Those pleas went unheard, and the Bears won the title 9-0. Side note, the Portsmouth Spartans became the Detroit Lions in '34. So this rule became known as the Bronco Nagurski rule, and it's the rule that we have today that a legal forward pass simply must be made behind the line of scrimmage. Now, in about 30 years from this point, another quarterback would push the boundaries of the rules and lead to another change, and I'll talk about that on the 19th. On this day in 1961, it was one of the greatest upsets in the NFL. The Minnesota Vikings were an expansion team in '61, and so as a general rule, they're not supposed to be very good. The preseason, and we've talked a little about how the preseason back then differs from preseason games now, but suffice it to say that preseason games back in the '60s were a little bit better predictor of how things would go during the season. And one of the teams the Vikings played in the preseason that year was the Chicago Bears. The Bears won the preseason matchup 30-7. Just 2 weeks later, the Bears and Vikings would kick off their seasons against each other on this day. The Vikes were 29-point underdogs heading into this one, and despite head coach Norm Van Brocklin's midweek promise to rookie Fran Tarkenton that he was going to start at quarterback, he switched it up on Sunday and went instead with the veteran George Shaw. After the first quarter, though, things were not going very well for Minnesota, and Van Brocklin sent Tarkenton onto the field. Tarkenton proceeded to put on a display that had not been seen by a rookie quarterback in his debut in the history of the game. Tarkenton threw 23 passes, completed 17 of them for 250 yards and 4 touchdowns. He also ran another one en route to a 37-13 win in their franchise opener. No rookie quarterback making their debut had ever thrown for 4 touchdowns in a game, and that would not be equaled until Marcus Mariota threw 4 TDs in a game in 2015 in his NFL debut. And since we're talking about throwing the football a whole bunch, how about what happened on this day in 1994 when UNLV's Jason Davis completed 28 of 41 passes for 347 yards? Now, that would be a pretty decent game, but Davis did all of that in just the fourth quarter. Let me read those stats again, now that you know that part of the story. He completed 28 of 41 passes for 347 yards in a quarter. So UNLV was playing the Idaho Vandals, and the Rebels had gotten behind by a lot. They were down 45-10 heading into the final 15 minutes. So they were desperate. Not much to do when you trail by 35 other than air it out, right? And they did. They were also helped out a good bit by Idaho's 3 lost fumbles on their first 3 possessions of the fourth quarter. Davis threw 4 touchdowns, 3 of those to his favorite target, Randy Gatewood. The running Rebels held the ball for 11 minutes out of the 15, but despite the offensive explosion, it wasn't enough. Idaho, who was playing as a 1AA team at that point, tacked on a field goal to win the game 48-38. Davis's numbers of 41 pass attempts, 28 completions, and 347 yards passing are still NCAA records for a single quarter. Gatewood's 23 receptions on the day is still the record for catches in a game, but it is shared now. Time now for today's Nothing to Do with Sports Did You Know? In Japanese culture, there is a love of vending machines. There are about 6 million of them for all sorts of products, or about 1 vending machine for every 23 people in the country. That's all I've got for you today. This and every episode of This Day in Sports History is researched, written, voiced, and produced by me, Steve White. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you back here tomorrow for another edition of This Day in Sports History. This has been an original Thrive Suite production.